Hello, I'm Louisa Pilbeam. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the US takes a stake in Intel chipmaker, and Donald Trump pledges many more similar deals. Is this a push to support American industry or a slide towards state capitalism and government control over private business? Bangladesh warns it can no longer bear the cost of sheltering Rohingya refugees. That's as international humanitarian aid is declining. But who fills the gap? And could the crisis push the nation's public services to a breaking point? Global meat prices are at an all-time high, fueling fears over food inflation. So why is beef becoming so expensive? And could the spike worsen food insecurity in African nations? Big government is doing big business, but whether corporate America likes it or not is up for debate. The US has taken a stake in Intel chipmaker as part of a wider push to secure domestic production and reduce reliance on China. The acquisition is the most significant intervention in private business since the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis. And this may be just the start, with President Donald Trump pledging more deals ahead. Supporters call it smart industrial policy that will protect jobs and national security. But critics warn that it could mark a shift in the relationship between government and private companies and raises concerns about how much control a president should have over business. So why is Donald Trump making such deals? Imogen Kimber reports. Harry Broadman is a former chief of staff at the US President's Council of Economic Advisers who served under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. And he joins us from Washington, D.C. Harry, thank you very much for joining us. So a big question is, why has Donald Trump taken this 10% stake in Intel? Is this about shoring up a company, or is there more at play here?
Well, it's certainly shoring up a company. I also think it is consistent increasingly with how he has dealt with corporate behavior and corporate investment in the United States, sort of a more of a statist approach, if you will.
State capitalism, though, is nothing new. So governments have been investing in companies and industries to boost business and protect them. China, Russia, France, Germany, for example. But does this particularly go against what the US does, because it goes against the Republican gospel of free market capitalism?
Well, what used to be the Republican gospel of free market capitalism, I think, has been shifting to the left, if you will, more towards statist approaches in the United States. Now, listen, there are certainly cases where we want a more proactive government, particularly when it deals with patching up national security gaps, making sure that the infrastructure for the global economy in which the U.S. is participant is more robust. So there are justifications for that, but whether it's a broad brushed approach, that's a very different animal, I think, than what we in the United States have prided ourselves on in terms of our economic model.
And let me ask you, Harry, Donald Trump has called this a great deal for Intel and the American people. Do you believe that's so?
And, listen, both the legislative branch and the executive branch over the last couple of decades have recognized the importance of that technology, both, for our own economic growth, but more importantly, to maintain our competitiveness, particularly against, countries like China, which obviously have a much more statist approach, to say the least, than we do. So there is a justification, an economic justification, and a policy justification for having the federal government, and in some cases even the state governments, get involved to make sure that we have a robust infrastructure and competitiveness against other countries in the world, and I say in particularly with respect to China.
Let me look at the concerns for a moment, though. This isn't the only deal that the US has done recently. There's the NVIDIA and AMD deal, where those US companies have agreed to pay the government 15% of their revenues from sales of chips to, as you mentioned, China. So are these kinds of deals overreach?
Well, I mean, if you look back at the history of how the United States is operating, it probably does seem like overreach. But, and there's another example, of course, with respect to the merger of U.S. Steel and Nippon Steel. So when there are, what we would call backbone industries, particularly in technology, but also in steel making and other manufacturing sectors that are just important for the growth of the world economy and the U.S. economy, I can understand there is this justification. Now, it's a very different, I think, paradigm than other countries, particularly state-run economies such as China and so forth. So I think as long as it's done on a case-by-case basis, and that there are safeguards that would limit the reach of the government, then there is a justification for this. But I guess the concern that people have, particularly myself, is that Mr. Trump does not seem to operate from a stable playbook, and so what he might do one week might be different than the next week. And I think that if there was a rationale that he would articulate, say in a speech or in some kind of report by the cabinet, saying this is the way we need to operate now, that would be most helpful to understand for the public and for investors and for workers as to what the rationale is. And so far, he's not done that. He's been doing these on a case-by-case approach, and I think that makes a lot of people, including myself, nervous.
What about corporate America's response then? Are companies like Intel quietly ceding ground to Trump, avoiding confrontation and giving him unprecedented leverage over private business?
I guess I'm not surprised in this environment that is happening. And again, I think, if Intel were to announce and justify why they are doing this in this particular matter and how it fits in with their overall corporate strategy as a competitor in the world, I think that kind of justification would be very helpful. But, at least for those of us on the outside, we just see these announcements with very little rationale explained as to what is going on and why, Intel itself would say, well, this is in our best interest. Now, the fact that, increasingly businesses in the U.S. are kowtowing to Mr. Trump, that I think shows how much power he has amassed in the Oval Office, and the threats that he makes to industries obviously are ringing true to some captains of industry. And I think that's the issue is, are people so intimidated that they're not willing to articulate and say, well, let's do it this way, Mr. President.
Now, they've fled mass violence, including arson and sexual assaults at the hands of the military in Myanmar in 2017. Today, more than 1 million Muslim Rohingya live in dire conditions in the world's largest refugee camp in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. But international aid to support them is shrinking, and food vouchers have been cut in half, leaving many families surviving on barely $6 a month. The humanitarian crisis has stretched public services in Bangladesh to the limit and is spilling into the economy. Interim government leader Mohammed Yunus now says his country is running out of resources to support Rohingya refugees. He's urging the international community to step in and to work on a roadmap for the Rohingyas' voluntary return to Myanmar. Tanvir Chowdhury reports from Cox's Bazar. Mr. Fizur Rahman is an economist and distinguished fellow at the Centre for Policy Dialogue. He joins us from Dhaka now. Thank you for giving us your time. So have we hit a breaking point in the Rohingya crisis?
Thank you for having me. I think it is going towards that. The Rohingya refugees who in Bangladesh, we call them forcefully displaced Myanmar nationals, and Bangladesh gave them a place on a humanitarian grounds. So there are almost 1.3 million Rohingyas now, and obviously there is now after so many years there is an aid fatigue also, and Bangladesh also is becoming desperate because it is bearing the brunt of the people, and we are trying to do the best, but obviously it's now becoming unbearable also because as I said, the supply of foreign support is also coming down. There is a problem that's arising from that.
This is clearly a devastating situation for the Rohingya people. But we also have now the Bangladesh interim leader saying that his country can no longer afford to bear the brunt of the biggest refugee camp in the world. A huge economic strain over 8 years. How devastating has this been for Bangladesh's economy?
Bangladesh economy obviously is a large economy. We are a $460 billion economy. But in a country where poverty is so rampant, where there are so many people living below the poverty line, and also in the locality where the Rohingyas are, obviously it's a big strain on the local economy as well.
Is it foreseeable for Bangladesh to continue without more help?
It is very difficult, in fact, and that's why Professor Yunus, the head of the interim government of Bangladesh, said that we cannot really wait for the last Rohingyas to be driven to Bangladesh from Rakhine. So that's a clear signal that Bangladesh is really reaching a breaking point. And the Cox's Bazar event that took place during 24th and 26th August, there were 7 points that he mentioned. And he said that there has to be more aid coming. There has to be more global initiative in order that they can return to their homeland in safety.
What is life like for the Rohingya people? We've heard that the World Food Programme is going to need to halve their food vouchers from $12 to $6 a month. Can they survive on this? What is life like for them?
Obviously, you see, $12 a month for a person, you can very well understand what this can buy, even in the context of the purchasing power in Bangladesh. Obviously, very little, but that's what was the budget. But now, if it comes down from $12 to $6, obviously people will suffer.
Putting beef on the table has never cost more, with prices soaring worldwide. Global meat prices are at record highs, pushing food costs to the highest level in 2 years. The surge is being driven by droughts that have reduced cattle herds, disease outbreaks, and disrupted supplies. Trump's tariffs and trade tensions have supported the price rally. For many people in wealthy countries, it's a budget squeeze. But in poorer nations, it could make protein a luxury that many families can no longer afford. American shoppers, for example, paid almost $7 for almost half a kilo of beef in July. That's a record price. Meat prices are also rocketing in the UK, Australia, Canada and South Africa, among other nations. One of the main drivers of spiking costs is a drought that has affected several states in the US and Europe. Wandile Silobo is chief economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. He joins us from Pretoria in South Africa. Thank you so much for being on the programme. If we focus on South Africa now, meat prices have risen by 30% there. That's a big number. Can people in South Africa afford this?
We are coming from a low base in South Africa, so there is a base effect aspect that is playing part on this. But we generally view the increases that we are observing temporary, because there are two things that are changing. One, the ban on the imports of poultry from Brazil has now been lifted because Brazil has managed to control the outbreak that they suffered there on avian influenza. That will help on chicken meat. With regards to beef, the big thing in South Africa is the ongoing foot and mouth disease. Of course, that did lead to a decline in slaughtering, but we've seen now across the country vaccination getting some momentum, and we hope that over time that will lead to an increase in slaughtering, which is why we generally see this as somewhat of a short-term temporary increase, and we should see prices moderating towards the end of the year.
Bearing that in mind, though, what about inflation and the cost of living in South Africa, which is a concern for many people? Will this fuel that?
Inflation is, of course, a concern because right now, if you look at the figures from July, overall, the food price inflation was around 5.5%, which is the highest in about 18 months. The good thing about the current moment is that there is also a large grain harvest that is coming into the market, and as well as the fruit harvest. We've had a bumper crop, but there's always a lag between the increase in the harvest and the decline in farm prices between what you see at a retail level, which is why we think that the prices that you are currently seeing, all the way perhaps maybe going even in the August prices, will still be at these relatively elevated levels, with the hope then that as you enter the fourth quarter of the year, you should see some moderation. But certainly, as you rightly say, there is some strain in the households.
You said there's hope that this will improve by the end of the year, but what about the government? Is there a belief that the government's doing enough?
The South African government is doing something because remember, we do have some household support that the government has extended in the country. But of course, that doesn't take away, because the core problem of South Africa is also that we do have a relatively large population that lives in poverty, roughly 20% or so of South Africans that are in a tough condition. So whenever there's some increases in food prices, those people are hit the hardest, which is why we hope now then that with the large grain harvest and the large fruit harvest, that to a certain extent will make an impact. But certainly on a government side, there is something that is happening. But remember, there's a fiscal strain and the limits to what can be done in the near term.
Wandile Silubu, we really appreciate your time. Thank you. That is our show for this week. Do get in touch with us on X. I'm at Louisa Pilbeam TV. Use the hashtag AJCTC when you do that. Or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. There's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, and that will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Louisa Pilbeam from the whole team. Thank you for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is up next.